So, what happens next? Retired Lieutenant General Andrew Leslie served as Deputy Commander for the NATO mission to Afghanistan. He's now a Senior Associate at Blue Sky Strategy Group. He joins us via Zoom. And Roland Paris, a former Foreign Policy Advisor to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and a Director at the University of Ottawa School of Public and International Affairs. He's here in the studio. All right, Mr. Leslie, I'd like to start with you. Poland is still investigating. They haven't wrapped everything up, but it sure looks like this may have been a friendly fire incident that killed 2 people in eastern Poland. How much of a test was this for the NATO alliance?
Well, it could have been so much worse. And of course, sympathies and go out to those who suffered such a tragic loss. A key point was raised by Mr. Brown in his very good reporting from in theater. The results, or the reason why that anti-aircraft missile was up in the air chasing a Russian missile, was because the Russians were busy attacking with over 100 missiles and rockets yesterday, a series of hospitals, power grids, hydro generation plants with the intent of shattering the resistance of the Ukraine people. By the way, that has never worked historically, just bombing from the air. It just has never worked. The Lord only knows why the Russians are still doing this, but it's barbaric in the extreme. I think it could have been so much worse if cool heads had not prevailed. Thankfully, they did.
Right, and certainly Roland Paris, that was the advice you and retired General Leslie had last night. I wonder, though, Volodymyr Zelensky, he yesterday said this was an attack on the collective security of NATO in the early response to it. He still insists that this was not fired by Ukraine, that he believes, based on what his soldiers are telling him, that this was Russia.
Yeah, I think eventually he'll need to walk that back or just let it disappear in the mists of time. But, you know, he's obviously trying to get Western countries to provide more materiel for his war campaign, quite rightly. And I think that paradoxically for Russia, one of the effects of this accident will be that there'll be a lot more pressure on NATO to provide additional air defenses, both to Ukraine and probably in those bordering states. So Russia took it upon itself to launch this horrible strike against civilian targets, and as a result, there's probably going to be more air defenses.
Andrew Leslie, what's your sense of how Volodymyr Zelensky responded to this, even now, insisting it was not Ukraine, but it was likely Russia?
He's doing his job as president of an embattled nation that's had brilliant success on the local battlefield, but let's not forget there's still tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Russian occupiers inside his territory. So he will use each and every opportunity he can to leverage NATO to provide more money, and more importantly than money, more weapon systems, just like Roland was mentioning, some anti-aircraft systems, sophisticated ones to help in knocking down such attacks by Russia, hopefully more sophisticated than the S-300, which, by the way, is no slouch when it comes to knocking down aircraft and missiles, but more is needed.
Right, and Roland Paris, you know, Andrew Leslie makes a point that bombing from the air, missiles like this, they aren't effective in a military campaign, but Russia does keep doing it. And I remember traveling with the Prime Minister to the G7 in Germany, and there was a strike at a shopping mall and civilian targets right before Zelensky addressed the G7, and now you think there may be some coincidence with the G20 meeting.
Well, I mean, it's quite, who knows, inside of Putin's head.
Right.
But this kind of multi-directional missile strike would take time to plan. So I think the timing wasn't accidental, whether it was meant to be a signal in the aftermath of the withdrawal from Kharkiv, that the Russians are still there, we're strong, whether it was meant as a signal to the hawks, right-wing hawks and bloggers in Russia who have been calling for more aggressive action, and therefore, you know, Putin is giving them a little bit of the meat that they want. Who knows? But it's also possible that this did coincide with Volodymyr Zelensky's presentation to the G20, and it might have been meant to upstage that. Of course, Putin didn't go to the G20. But as we saw, the G20 leaders were more or less united in responding to it.
Andrew Leslie, do you think this is diplomacy by missile, that he's trying to use these airstrikes, Putin, of course, to send a message to the West and other world leaders?
That's a very good way of putting it, actually. He's got nothing else going for him right now. His troops are in disarray. The Ukraine have accomplished a bounce crossing in small numbers on the other side of the major river obstacle that Russia was so busy getting behind and preparing defenses. Well, the Ukraine is already partially behind them. The war is not going well either in the Ukraine form or at home. Pressure is building. So all he's got, much akin to a spoiled brat, is lashing out with clubs, in this case missiles, some of which come from Iran. Gosh knows what he's trading to Iran for, the missiles. That's worthy of some investigation. And an immature killer, quite frankly, who has no real standing on the world stage apart from this, how big an explosion it can cause on innocent Ukrainian civilians in hospitals and trying to get on with their lives.
Right. And one important point to put out there, this was a Soviet-made missile or a Russian-made missile, but a lot of Ukraine's military hardware is Soviet era, right? It's left over because they were a former Soviet state. So just to explain how it can be a Russian missile that was fired by the Ukrainians, for people maybe wondering about that at home. But Roland Paris, you've both talked about how this maybe spurs NATO to do more. I mean, what does that look like? Because the concern has been to contain this, stop it from spilling over. We've had this, I know it was an accidental thing from Ukraine, but what does an increased NATO response to this look like tangibly in that battlefield and in the neighboring countries?
Well, maybe I can just quickly make the point that by all accounts, Russia is running out of precision-guided missiles right now. And the campaign, which seems to be intended to destroy the spirit of the Ukrainian people, is not working. So to underline what Andy just said, it seems like a desperation strategy. With regard to NATO, I think we'll see a continuation of the supply of more and more advanced weapon systems. Of course, the concern has been, number one, to keep NATO troops outside of Ukraine to prevent this from becoming a Russia-NATO direct war. And secondly, to try to manage the weapon systems that are being provided to Ukraine so that there's a minimal chance of Ukraine using those weapon systems to attack Russian territory. And that's where the sophistication of the systems comes into play. But we'll see. I'm sure we will see more anti-aircraft defense systems and more advanced air defense systems being deployed both in Ukraine and in the bordering countries.
So, Andrew, Leslie, how do they manage that in terms of giving Ukraine what it needs to win and to survive, but not giving Ukraine what it can use to attack Russia directly inside Russian territory?
Put simply, what the Ukraine wants are fighter ground attack aircraft, attack helicopters, main battle tanks, and long-range rocket systems for the long-range American MLRS, long-range artillery. They're not going to get the fighter bombers, nor are they going to get the tanks. But I can see large numbers of air defense systems from those nations which have them and can spare them will be making their way to essentially the border region even over the next couple of days. It's undoubted. And more anti-tank systems, handheld, more sophisticated command and control architectures, winter warfare equipment, of which Canada is providing some amounts, more medical supplies. It's not money necessarily. Of course, money is vitally important to cities that have been smashed and people are unemployed. But right now it's weapon systems, because the Ukraine doesn't look like they're stopping as they settle, or as some people expected them to settle into defensive positions for the winter. They're still moving. Yeah, they're still attacking.
No, they say, Roland Paris, this is a final thought. They seem to have Russia on the run a little bit, though there is still a massive Russian military presence inside Ukraine's territorial borders. Yeah,
I mean, you know, we've talked about this before. The assumption that the offensive would stop because of winter, that comes from people who don't live in winter climates. You know, hard ground is great ground, and rivers get frozen. You don't always have to have bridges to cross them. Right. So I would expect the offensive to continue. Who knows exactly in what direction? But here's one last little tidbit, which is I noticed that Donald Trump Jr. and Marjorie Taylor Greene both used this event as an opportunity to say, you see, we shouldn't be giving any weapons or money to Ukraine at all because it was a Ukrainian missile that hit Poland. Talk about that logic.
Well, that's a whole wormhole, a rabbit hole. We're not going to go down here right now because we're trying to keep...
I'm anticipating your political panic.
Yeah, all right. I don't know if we're going to talk about Marjorie Taylor Greene or Donald Trump Jr. We will talk about Donald Trump later in the show. Thanks so much, gentlemen. Andrew, Leslie, Roland Paris, thanks for coming in. Appreciate it. Okay, here for more on this story is Poland's ambassador to Canada, Witold Dzielski. Ambassador, thank you so much for coming in. I'm wondering if you can walk us through what we know right now, because things have changed dramatically in the last 24 hours. What have you found about how this explosion happened?
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's good to talk about the facts, and it's good to talk also about the context a little bit. So, you know, Russia invaded Ukraine in February, and since that time the war was raging in Ukraine, and the Russian conducted loads of atrocities, and acts they commit against the civilians, against regular Ukrainian people, and against the infrastructure are simply horrid. Having that said, if Russia did not invade Ukraine, we would not have this situation today. And what Secretary General Stoltenberg has said that I mean, there is no reason to discuss it further. I mean, the context.
Well, that seems to be a fairly unanimous position with NATO and Western countries and their allies that even if this was a Ukrainian missile, the entire thing has been caused by Russia, and that's where ultimate blame lands. But what can you tell us about how you've determined that it was, in fact, a missile as part of Ukrainian anti-missile systems that was fired into your country?
Yesterday, as Poland and quite a bit of the world was in shock, Polish authorities began the investigation. I believe to a great extent it continues at this point, so we are waiting for the final information. I did not get it so far, so I believe it's ongoing, and it is very much related to the political process which is going on, which involves conversations with international partners. Polish leaders, including President Andrzej Duda and Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki, had conversations with basically everybody in the NATO alliance, with Jens Stoltenberg, Secretary General of NATO, with the President of the United States, today with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, and many other conversations. So this will go down to some sort of conclusion probably in days to come.
So, we've heard what all of those world leaders have said, but I'm sure you've also heard what President Zelensky has said, where he says there's no way this was a Ukrainian missile, and he says the information he has from his military is that it wasn't their fault. I mean, how do you interpret that?
Well, I would not comment on that conversation because, speculations would only help the Russian propaganda. So and Russian manipulations which are taking place in that area as well. So I would suggest to wait with the speculations until there is a certain conclusion and the politicians speak with the same voice. And let me assure you that Poland and Ukraine obviously are strongest allies that there can be. Polish president, Ukrainian president are very close friends, and I'm sure there will be quite soon a conclusion, and all the parties defending Ukraine will speak with the same voice.
Right, and I appreciate the desire to wait for a conclusion, but we have already heard from the U.S., from NATO, that this was most likely a Ukrainian missile. I'm just curious, do you share that conclusion that on the balance of probabilities right now, this was most likely an accident and a Ukrainian missile went into your country?
Definitely this was something that was not intentional, and this is the element of the assessment that I have at this point.
Okay, intentional or not, there are 2 people dead, and this is obviously a tragedy for your country and for the families and friends of people who knew them. I mean, does this in any way have the potential to maybe undermine Polish support for Ukraine and what's happening right now?
It is a very serious situation. And again, I mean, in Poland, everybody understands that this situation would not happen if it was not for the Russian. So in that sense, whether it was a Russian missile, whether it was a Ukrainian air defense, whether the missile came from Mars, it's Russian fault.
What was your reaction when you heard the news? Because the initial assessment was that this was Russia, because it was Russian-made, and obviously a lot of Ukrainian military equipment is old Soviet-era stuff that they kept, after the breakup of the Soviet Union. So it's not a surprise it would have Russian-made equipment. But when I saw that yesterday, I immediately jumped to Article 5, it's an attack, and where this would go under NATO and the possibility of this widening into a broader conflict. I just wonder at a basic human level, how did you react when you heard this?
I think, Poles around the world and diplomats in Polish embassies had a very similar sense of concern. That's horror, maybe that's too much, but somewhere between concern and horror. I would imagine. Yesterday down here we were in the midst of preparations for the huge gala, because yesterday we were celebrating here in Ottawa the 80th anniversary of the bilateral relations between Canada and Poland. And we have two official delegations from Poland right now in the city. So the news was a huge shock for us, and naturally, everything went to the side, and everybody started working on the topic. But we were deeply worried, right. And as I told you earlier in our conversation, it's for all of us. It was really difficult to go to sleep yesterday because of the time difference. As we were going to sleep, we knew that in a couple of hours there will be some pieces of information coming out. So it was yeah.
The consensus seems to be, regardless of whether this was a Ukrainian missile, this is amongst the allies, this is still Russia's fault, and that nobody is weakening the resolve to support President Zelensky and his people in their fight against this. But there's also been some analysis that this could invite a larger NATO response and maybe a beefing up of air defense in your country, for example, on the border. I mean, what do you think happens next in terms of the NATO response, in the aftermath of what has happened here?
Well, Poland, as you know, was at the forefront from the very beginning of war. We've provided a lot of support to Ukrainians, and in numbers that's we are at the level of 15 billion Canadian dollars worth of support. Poland's number 3 in terms of military support provided. So we encourage continuously to provide further support to Ukrainians for them to win the war, but we also encourage partners to provide continuous additional support to the eastern NATO flank, both in the area of military, but also in the area of supporting our countries, Poland, countries of the region, in supporting the refugees. As you know, millions have crossed the Polish-Ukrainian border, and Poland is doing a spectacular job, and Poles are doing a spectacular job in providing support to millions of Ukrainians.
Okay. Ambassador, thanks for coming in, and we'd love to talk to you again if there's an update. We appreciate your time.
Thank you so much.